Hotel. Give me just a second to make sure that I have everything set up correctly. Welcome in. Once again, this your brother Matthew Daniels, aka I'm Pooh, aka the Chosen Few, aka the Real Bookworm. But I'm not just a bookworm world, I am the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. And as always, may your name live on forever, and may your memory, family, never die. Let me get this thing set up. Make sure I got my audio good. Make sure I got my screen share set up correctly. And then we're going to be getting right off into the video. May your name live on forever, and may your memory, family, never die. Just like we want the names and the memories of our ancestors to never die. Here on Matthew Daniels TV, we are allowing the ancestors to speak, and we are dealing with the history of our ancestors, primarily centered on the time period of slavery and immediately after. Now, today, I'm basically just going to be doing a reading, and I will go into some commentary here and there, but not a lot. But I'm basically going to be doing a reading from the autobiography of ancestor Charles Ball. And I'm going to be reading through chapter 1. Now, this particular slave narrative, this oral history is very extensive. And so I'm not going to be able to go over all of it in one video. So I'm going to break it up over a extended period of time. But today we're going to be looking at chapter 1. Now, as you guys know, I've been bringing to you the slave narratives and the quote unquote the oral histories of our ancestors. But what I want you guys to realize is that while I have primarily been focused on bringing you the slave narratives of our ancestors that were recorded around 1936 and 1937, the genre of literature that's called the slave narratives existed long before then. And so there were plenty of our ancestors who escaped to freedom or who managed to purchase their freedom and move to the north and move to Canada, or move to England and places like that. There are plenty of our ancestors who gained their freedoms by various means and documented their experiences during slavery. Now, one of the main reasons that they did this was part of the abolitionist movement. Now, the abolitionist movement was a movement geared towards bringing an end to the enslavement of our ancestors. So what they realized was that the majority of people, the majority of the public, they didn't really have a firsthand knowledge and understanding of how barbarous the institution of slavery was. They didn't know about the horrors that our ancestors were enduring, especially and primarily on those slave plantations in the deep south. So what the abolitionists decided to do, they decided to get ex-slaves to begin putting their stories, their life stories down in book form so that they could sell these books to the general public. And by selling these books to the general public, more people could become aware of the horrors that our ancestors faced on the slave plantations. And the idea was once individuals were made aware of the horrors that our ancestors were enduring on the slave plantations, then more people would join the abolitionist movement and they would eventually bring the institution of slavery to an end. So one such ancestor who acquired his freedom and put his autobiography down in book form is the ancestor Charles Ball. Now, this ancestor is an ancestor that we should all know about because his life did not start and stop with slavery. He went on to do great things, and he went on to be honored by the very nation that we call home. So I want you guys to just sit back and enjoy this reading of the autobiography of the ancestor Charles Ball. We're going to be looking at chapter 1. Now, before I actually start reading, I want to show you guys something. I want to show you guys why it's so important to know this ancestor. I want you guys to look at your screen. Okay. When you look at your screen, you're going to see 4 individuals in Navy uniforms saluting a monument with a multicolored wreath in front of it. Now, why this image is so important, I'm going to explain to you in just a second. But the caption associated with this image reads, U.S. Navy Honor Guard salute during August 23rd, 2014, dedication of the official Battle of Bladensburg Memorial by the state of Maryland, showing the bronze relief sculpture of an unidentified U.S. Marine, a wounded Commodore Joshua Barney, and Charles Ball, the sailor on the right, rallying around a cannon in the American forces' last stand against the British advance. So when you look at that monument on your screen, the man standing to the right holding he isn't holding a gun. I'm not 100% sure what that item is called that he's holding, but the individual standing up to the right, that's the ancestor Charles Ball. That man was actually born in slavery, and he lived such an amazing life that in 2024, there is a monument dedicated to the Battle of Bladensburg that he participated in, and we see 4 US members of the U.S. Navy Honor Guard saluting this monument with our ancestor who was born in slavery on it. Now, I wanted to start this video off with that image there because I feel that that is a powerful, powerful image. Now, as we read the autobiography of this great man and we find out just what he did to achieve such status in our country today, I wanted you guys to understand that our ancestors are honored for their achievements to this country. Slavery is not the end all be all for our history. So, who is Charles Ball? Who is the individual whose autobiography we're going to be reading? Charles Ball was born into slavery on a Maryland Charles Ball was born into slavery on a Maryland tobacco plantation sometime around 1781. He lived there with his mother and siblings until about 1785, when the owner's death forced the estate to be sold up and slaves sold away. Ball was sold to Jack Cox, a farmer with several slaves, who treated Ball with humanity. Following Cox's death, Ball was sold again to a much more severe owner who furnished little food or clothing for his slaves, keeping Ball in a constant state of cold and hunger. When he was approximately 20 years old, around 1800, Ball's master hired him out to the Navy. When Ball arrived at the Washington Navy Yard, he was stationed as a cook aboard the USS Congress. For a hungry young man used to a hard life as a field slave, this hardly seemed like work at all. Ball was eager to please officers and in turn was gifted with hand-me-down clothing and for the first time in his life, some spending money. After nearly 2 years in the service of the Navy, Ball encountered a novelty, a free man of color and sailor from Philadelphia. Together, they devised a scheme to smuggle Ball to freedom in the North, but no sooner did they complete their plan than Ball's former master returned to reclaim him and sell him again, eventually away from his family down to South Carolina. So again, today we're going to be taking a look at the autobiography of ancestor Charles Ball. We're going to be allowing the ancestors to speak. And ancestor Charles Ball, may your name live on forever and may your memory never die. This is chapter 1 with brief moments of commentary given by myself, Matthew Daniels. Chapter 1. The system of slavery as practiced in the United States has been and is now but little understood to the people who live north of the Potomac and the Ohio. For although individual cases of extreme cruelty and oppression occasionally occur in Maryland, yet the general treatment of the black people is far more lenient and mild in that state than it is further south. This, I presume, is mainly to be attributed to the vicinity of the Free State of Pennsylvania, but in no small degree to the influence of the population of the cities of Baltimore and Washington over the families of the planters of the surrounding counties. For experience has taught me that both masters and mistresses, who, if not observed by strangers, would treat their slaves with the utmost rigor, are so far operated upon by a sense of shame or pride as to provide them tolerably with both food and clothing, when they know their conduct is subject to the observation of persons whose good opinion they wish to preserve. A large number of the most respectable and wealthy people in both Washington and Baltimore, being altogether opposed to the practice of slavery, hold a constant control over the actions of their friends, the formers, and thus prevent much misery. But in the South, the case is widely different. There, every man and every woman too, except prevented by poverty, is a slaveholder, and the entire white population is leagued together by a common bond of the most sordid interest in the torture and oppression of the poor descendants of Africa. If the Negro is wronged, there is no one to whom he can complain. If suffering for want of the coarsest food, he dare not steal. If flogged till the flesh falls from his bones, he must not murmur. And if compelled to perform his daily toil in an iron collar, no expression of resentment must escape his lips. People of the northern states who make excursions to the south, visit the principal cities and towns, travel the most frequented highways, or even sojourn for a time at the residences of the large planters, and partake of their hospitality and amusements, know nothing of the condition of the southern slaves. To acquire this knowledge, the traveler must take up his abode for a season in the lodge of the overseer, pass a summer in the remote cotton fields, or spend a year within view of the rice swamps. By attending for 1 month the court which the overseer of a large estate holds every evening in the cotton gin yard, and witnessing the execution of his decrees, a Turk or a Russian would find the tribunals of his country far outdone. It seems to be a law of nature that slavery is equally destructive to the master and the slave. For whilst it stupefies the latter with fear and reduces him below the condition of man, it brutalizes the former by the practice of continual tyranny, and makes him the prey of all the vices which render human nature loathsome. In the following simple narrative of an unlearned man, I have endeavored, faithfully and truly, to present to the reader some of the most material accidents which occurred to myself in a period of 30 years of slavery in the free republic of the United States, as well as many circumstances which I observed in the condition and conduct of other persons during that period. It has been supposed by many that the state of the Southern slaves is constantly becoming better, and that the treatment which they receive at the hands of their masters is progressively milder and more humane. But the contrary of all this is unquestionably the truth. For, under the bad culture which is practiced in the South, the land is constantly becoming poorer, and the means of getting food more and more difficult. So long as the land is new and rich and produces corn and sweet potatoes abundantly, the black people seldom suffer greatly for food. But when the ground is all cleared and planted in rice or cotton, corn and potatoes become scarce. And when corn has to be bought on a cotton plantation, the people must expect to make acquaintance with hunger. My grandfather was brought from Africa and sold as a slave in Calvert County in Maryland about the year 1730. I never understood the name of the ship in which he was imported, nor the name of the planter who bought him on his arrival, but at the time I knew him, he was a slave in a family called Manuel, who resided near Leonardtown. My father was a slave in a family named Hans, living near the same place. My mother was the slave of a tobacco planter, an old man who died, according to the best of my recollection, when I was about 4 years old, leaving his property in such a situation that it became necessary, as I suppose, to sell a part of it to pay his debts. Soon after his death, several of his slaves, and with others, myself, were sold at public venue. My mother had several children, my brothers and sisters, and we were all sold on the same day to different purchasers. Our new master took us away, and I never saw my mother nor any of my brothers and sisters afterwards. This was, I presume, about the year 1785. I learned subsequently from my father that my mother was sold to a Georgia trader, who soon after that carried her away from Maryland. Her other children were sold to slave dealers from Carolina and were also taken away, so that I was left alone in Calvert County with my father, whose owner lived only a few miles from my new master's residence. At the time I was sold, I was quite naked, having never had any clothes in my life. But my new master had brought with him a child's frock or wrapper belonging to one of his own children. And after he had purchased me, he dressed me in this garment, took me before him on his horse, and started home. But my poor mother, when she saw me leaving her for the last time, ran after me, took me down from the horse, clasped me in her arms, and wept loudly and bitterly over me. My master seemed to pity her and endeavored to soothe her distress by telling her that he would be a good master to me and that I should not want anything. She then, still holding me in her arms, walked along the road beside the horse as he moved slowly and earnestly and imploringly besought my master to buy her and the rest of her children and not permit them to be carried away by the Negro buyers. But while thus entreated him to save her and her family, the slave driver who had first bought her came running in pursuit of her with a raw hide in his hand. When he overtook us, he told her he was her master now and ordered her to give that little Negro to its owner and come back with him. My mother then turned to him and cried, "Oh, master, do not take away my child from, do not take me from my child." Without making any reply, he gave her 2 or 3 heavy blows on the shoulders with his rawhide, snatched me from her arms, handed me to my master, and seizing her by one arm, dragged her back towards the place of sale. My master then quickened the pace of his horse, and as we advanced, the cries of my poor parent became more and more indistinct. At length, they died away in the distance, and I never again heard the voice of my poor mother. Young as I was, the horrors of that day sank deeply into my heart, and even at this time, though half a century has elapsed, the terrors of the scene still return with painful vividness upon my memory. Frightened at the sight of the cruelties inflicted upon my poor mother, I forgot my own sorrows at parting from her and clung to my new master as an angel and a savior, when compared with the hardened fiend into whose powers she had fallen. She had been a kind and good mother to me, had warmed me in her bosom in the cold nights of winter, and had often divided the scanty pittance of food allowed her by her mistress between my brothers and sisters and me, and gone supperless to bed herself. Whatever victuals she could obtain beyond the coarse food, salt, fish, and cornbread allowed to slaves on the Potawks and Potomac rivers, she carefully distributed among her children and treated us with all the tenderness which her own miserable condition would permit. I have no doubt that she was chained and driven to Carolina and toiled out the residue of her forlorn and famished existence in the rice swamps or indigo fields of the South. My father never recovered from the effects of the shock, which this sudden and overwhelming ruin of his family gave him. He had formerly been of a gay, social temper, and when he came to see us on a Saturday night, he always brought us some little present, such as the means of a poor slave would allow: apples, melons, sweet potatoes, or, if he could procure nothing else, a little parched corn, which tasted better in our cabin because he had brought it. He spent the greater part of his time, which his master permitted him to pass with us, in relating such stories as he had learned from his companions, or in singing the rude songs common amongst the slaves of Maryland and Virginia. After this time, I never heard him laugh heartily or sing a song. He became gloomy and morose in his temper to all but me, and spent nearly all his leisure time with my grandfather, who claimed kindred with some royal family in Africa, and had been a great warrior in his native country. The master of my father was a hard, penurious man, and so exceedingly avaricious that he scarcely allowed himself the common conveniences of life. A stranger to sensibility, he was incapable of tracing the change in the temper and deportment of my father to its true cause, but attributed it to a sullen discontent with his condition as a slave and a desire to abandon his service and seek his liberty by escaping to some of the free states. To prevent the perpetration of such suspected crime of running away from slavery, the old man resolved to sell my father to a southern slave dealer, and accordingly applied to one of these men, who was at that time in Calvert, to become the purchaser. The price was agreed on, but as my father was a very strong, active, and resolute man, it was deemed unsafe for the Georgian to attempt to seize him, even with the aid of others in the daytime when he was at work. As it was known, he carried upon his person a large knife. It was therefore determined to secure him by stratagem, and for this purpose a farmer in the neighborhood, who was made privy to the plan, alleged that he had lost a pig which must have been stolen by someone, and that he suspected my father to be the thief. A constable was employed to arrest him, but as he was afraid to undertake the business alone, he called on his way at the house of the master of my grandfather to procure assistance from the overseer of the plantation. When he arrived at the house, the overseer was at the barn, and thither he repaired to make his application. At the end of the barn was the coach house, and as the day was cool, to avoid the wind, which was high, the two walked to the side of the coach house to talk over the matter and settle their plan of operations. It so happened that my grandfather, whose business it was to keep the coach in good condition, was at work at this time, rubbing the plaited handles of the doors and brightening the other metallic parts of the vehicle. Hearing the voice of the overseer without, he suspended his work and listened attentively, became a party to their counsels. They agreed that they would delay the execution of their project until the next day, as it was then late. They supposed they would have no difficulty in apprehending their intended victim, as, knowing himself innocent of the theft, he would readily consent to go with the constable to a justice of the peace to have the charge examined. That night, however, about midnight, my grandfather silently repaired to the cabin of my father, a distance of about 3 miles, aroused him from his sleep, made him acquaintance with the extent of his danger, gave him a bottle of cider and a small bag of parched corn, and then praying to the God of his native country to protect his son, enjoined him to fly from the destruction which awaited him. In the morning, the Georgian could not find his newly purchased slave, who was never seen or heard of in Maryland from that day. He probably had prudence enough to conceal himself in the day and travel only at night, by this means making his way slowly up the country between the Patapsco and Patuax until he was able to strike across to the north and reach Pennsylvania. After the flight of my father, my grandfather was the only person left in Maryland with whom I could claim kindred. He was, at that time, an old man, as he himself said, nearly 80 years of age, and he manifested towards me all the fondness which a person so far advanced in life could be expected to feel for a child. As he was too feeble to perform much hard labor, his master did not require him either to live or to work with the common field hands, who were employed the greater part of the year in cultivating tobacco and preparing it for market, that being the staple crop of all the lower part of the western shore of Maryland at that time. Indeed, old Ben, as my grandfather was called, had always expressed great contempt for his fellow slaves, they being, as he said, a mean and vulgar race, quite beneath his rank and the dignity of his former station. He had, during all the time that I knew him, a small cabin of his own, with about half an acre of ground attached to it, which he cultivated on his own account, and from which he drew a large portion of his subsistence. He entertained strange and peculiar notions of religion and prayed every night, though he said he ought to pray oftener, but that his God would excuse him for the non-performance of his duty in consideration of his being a slave and compelled to devote his whole time to the service of his master. He never went to church or meeting and held, and that religion of his country was all too and the religion of this country was altogether false, and indeed no religion at all, being the mere invention of priests and crafty men who hoped thereby to profit through the ignorance and credulity of the multitude. In support of this opinion, he maintained that there could only be one true standard of faith, which was the case in his country, where all the people worshiped together in the same assembly and believed in the same doctrines which had been of old time delivered by the true God to a holy man who was taken up into heaven for that purpose, and after he had received the divine communication, had returned to earth and spent 100 years in preaching and imparting the truth which had been revealed to him to mankind. This inspired man resided in some country a great distance from that of my grandfather, but had come there across a part of the sea, in company with an angel, and instructed the people in the mysteries of the true faith, which had ever since been preserved in its utmost purity by the descendants of those who received it through a period of more than 10,000 years. My grandfather said that the tenets of this religion were so plain and self-evident that anyone could understand them without any other instruction than the reading of a small book, a copy of which was kept in every family, and which contained all the rules, both of faith and practice, necessary for anyone to know or exercise. No one was permitted to expound or explain this book, as it was known to be the oracle of the true God, and it was held impious for any person to give a construction to his words different from that which was so palpable and manifestly expressed on the face of the book. This book was this book was likewise written in such plain and intelligible language that only one meaning could possibly be given to any one part of it, and was withal so compendious and brief that people could with very little labor commit the whole of its precepts to memory. The priest had at several times attempted to publish commentaries and glossaries upon this book, but as often as this had been attempted, the perpetrators had been tried, found guilty of conspiring to corrupt the public morals, and then banished from the country. People who were disposed to worship publicly convened together in summer under the boughs of a large tree, and the eldest person present read the inspired book from the beginning to end, which could be done in 2 hours at most. Sometimes a priest was employed to read the book, but he was never by any means allowed to add any observations of his own, as it would have been considered absurd as well as very wicked for a mere man to attempt to add to, alter, amend, or in any manner give a coloring to the revealed word of God. In winter, when it rained constantly, the worshippers met under the roof of a house covered with the leaves of a certain tree, which grew in great abundance on the margins of all the streams. The law imposed no penalties on those who did not profess to believe the contents of the sacred book, but those who did not live according to its rules were deemed bad subjects and were compelled to become soldiers as being fit only for a life of bloodshed and cruelty. The book inculcated no particular form of belief and left men free to profess what faith they pleased, but its principles of morality were extremely rigid and uncompromising. Love of country, charity, and social affection were the chief points of duty enjoined by it. Lying and drunkenness were strictly prohibited, and those guilty of these vices were severely punished. Cruelty was placed in the same rank of crimes, but the mode of punishment was left entirely to the civil lawgiver. The book required neither fastings, penances, nor pilgrimages, but tenderness to wives and children was one of its most positive injunctions. This has been the autobiography of Charles Ball, Chapter 1. Thank you for listening. Now, real quick, shout out to the chat. Alpha Plus, I seen you in the chat, family, but I wanted to finish reading that chapter 1 first. Big up to you too. Sandra asks you, good afternoon. I hope you have a wonderful day as well. A few things that I want to point out about that reading of chapter 1 that I noticed. In the very beginning, if you notice, our ancestor, he attempts to paint a picture of slavery in the United States. And the picture that he paints is almost of it was two types of slavery. You had the slavery in the North and you had the slavery in the South. Now, while all slavery was bad, and while all slavery was detrimental to our ancestors, it is generally understood that the slavery in the South was extremely worse. In fact, one of the punishments that was threatened on our ancestors if they misbehaved was they would be threatened to be sold to a plantation in the South. None of our ancestors wanted to be sold down South. Now, the ancestor Charles Ball in chapter 1, he gives us some insight into why that was. And from his explanation, he says that one of the main reasons that it was like that is because in the North, they were closer, the slave-holding states were closer in proximity to the free states where our ancestors, the Negroes, were free. And so in these areas that were in close proximity to free states, the individuals that owned slaves, they weren't necessarily better in their hearts than the slave owners in the South, but they knew that their actions were being observed by the other whites, many of them being abolitionists, many of them being Quakers who were abolitionists, religious abolitionists, and many of them coming from states where slavery wasn't practiced. And so in the North, the treatment of our ancestors were better because the ones that owned our ancestors wanted to portray a certain image of themselves to their neighbors. Okay, like you may have somebody that's a low down, dirty, rotten individual on the inside, but they may try to play a role as if they are an upstanding citizen with a heart of gold to the outside world. So they will not do the things that they would normally do because they do not want to be judged in a bad light by their neighbors. And so the ancestor Charles Ball says that was probably the primary reason why slavery in the North was different than slavery in the South. Whereas when you went into the South, there were more slaveholding states, and on average, all of them were deplorable. All of them were vile, or the majority of them. So no one would bat an eye when they would see one of our ancestors tied to the stocks or tied to a tree and whipped until they were bled and whipped until they died. And so the conditions of slavery in the South were a lot worse. And so it was good that he gave us that particular insight. He also gives us some insight based on his life experiences of the fact that a lot of our ancestors, they had no real family structure. And if they did have a family structure or they were in contact with their parents or their brothers and sisters, it was sparingly, because generally a man and a woman on the same plantation very, 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 very rarely were allowed to get married and have children. Predominantly, the husband would have to be on one plantation and the mother would have to be on another plantation, and then they would be able to get married if their respective slave masters gave the authorization for them to get married. And so there was no real family structure for our ancestors. But we can see that Charles Ball said that, and a lot of our ancestors say this, that oftentimes the father would get a pass from his slave master to come visit the mother on her plantation and to visit the children whenever that option was actually available. So even in those types of situations, our ancestors still tried to have some form of family structure. Now, one of the reasons why they would break up this family structure, one reason they would take the babies from the mothers and keep the fathers away, for one, they didn't want to see our ancestors as human, because the more they saw our ancestors as human, the more they would have to be convicted within themselves to admit that what they were doing was animalistic and beastly behavior, and they wanted to pretend that they were good Christian people. So they had to say that the Negro race, was not human, to justify in their own minds and in their own hearts why it was okay to treat us like they did. So they would break up the families because they didn't see us as human, and also they would break up the families and sell the children away from the mothers because they did not want an individual to be able to pass down history, pass down culture, pass down a way of life or teaching. They would snatch a child away from his mother and snatch a child away from his father so that they could not put things in them that would assist them into potentially growing up to want to overthrow the system that they were in. They would take the children, sell them off to another plantation, and as they grew, they would teach them that they were created by God to be slaves. Now, there's another interesting thing in chapter 1, the autobiography of Charles Ball, that I'm going to have to do an entire show about. It needs its own show, where he explains to us that his grandfather was from Africa. Now, if you were paying attention, he gives us a lot of good insight into his grandfather's religion. One of the first things that should have stood out to you is that he said his grandfather in his own country in Africa, they had a religion that was not the religion that was on these shores. So we know that it wasn't Christianity. Now, there are some talks that perhaps he was talking about Islam. However, as we go further, when I start reading more chapters in his autobiography, it becomes clear that both Charles Ball and his grandfather, they know what Islam is, because they are going to describe some people's religions as Mohammedans, and he doesn't describe his grandfather's religion as a Mohammedan. Okay, so it's not Islam, it's not Christianity, but they have a book associated. Pay attention, they had a book associated with their religious beliefs. And it is said from them that this book has been in existence for over 10,000 years. It is said that 10,000 years ago, a particular holy man was taken up into heaven, and God showed this man things and told this man things and gave this man a religious construct that he could give to the people. And this man came back to heaven accompanied with an angel, and he went around the world, basically, or at least around Africa, teaching people this religion and giving people this law and giving people this moral standard. And he says that every family had a copy of this book in their homes. Now, how many times have you heard that our ancestors on the west coast of Africa and our ancestors in Central Africa, they couldn't write? They had no writing system of their own. They were savages, right? That's a lie. That's a lie. I can't 100% prove it, but I just know in my heart they went into Western Central Africa and they destroyed the evidence of our ancestors' cultures, our ancestors' religions, and our ancestors' beliefs. They destroyed them. They had book burnings and everything. There's a first-hand account of the Portuguese who when they first went into the Congo area, and first at one point this Portuguese liar, he tries to say that they had no written works. They had no writing of their own. But then he slips up, and later on in his narrative, he tells the story about how when the Congolese were converted to Catholicism, which the majority of people in the Congo, they're Catholics now. This is a real story. When they converted them to Catholicism, he talks about all of their religious regalia, the statues that they made, the images of their gods, and even their sacred writings were burned. He talks about this great burning of their sacred writings. So here we have in the autobiography of Charles Ball, his grandfather came directly from Africa to the United States in 1730, and he tells us that in his country they had a holy book that the book was in all of the different households, and this book dated back 10,000 years to a holy man who went into heaven, communicated directly with God, and came back and gave this information to men all over the world. He wasn't from Charles Ball's grandfather's country. He came to that country to give them this truth. Now that's also interesting because he says even with this religious construct that his grandfather had in Africa, this religious construct allowed an individual to practice whatever faith they wanted. Any different faith that you have is okay. If you want to be a Christian, they didn't care. If you was a Muslim, they didn't care. If you was, it didn't exist then, but if you was a Jehovah's Witness, they didn't care. If you was a Catholic, they didn't care. If you was a Hindu, they didn't care. If you was a Buddhist, they didn't care. You could practice whatever faith that you wanted, but they had a system that came directly from God that was more centered around morals and standards. A big portion of it was how you're supposed to treat your wife and how you were supposed to treat your children. It was family orientated, and it was geared around love and support for your country. Now I'm going to do a video on this because you guys have to understand this, but just to show you, like this is so interesting, so interesting. He says that nobody could change this book. Nobody was allowed to change this book. Look, he says right here, the law that was in this religious book in Africa The law imposed no penalties on those who did not profess to believe the contents of the sacred book, but those who did not live according to its rules were deemed bad subjects and were compelled to become soldiers as being fit only for a life of bloodshed and cruelty. This book inculcated no particular form of belief and left men free to profess what faith they pleased, but its principles of morality were extremely rigid and uncompromising. Love of country, charity, and social affection were the chief points of duty enjoined by it. This how you know is not one of the Abrahamic religions that we know of. This how we know it is in Judaism, we know it is in Christianity, and we know it is in Islam, because in no way do those religions allow you to be anything that you want to be. It just is what it is. You can't be, you better not be no idol worshiper in none of those religions, or you definitely get in the hellfire. Well, I don't know about in Judaism, but you can't be a idolater in Judaism. You have to believe how they believe. And this is one of the things that made it so easy to, when we asked how was it so easy to convert our ancestors in Africa, and how was it so easy to infiltrate, right? How was it so easy to infiltrate? Well, their, especially what his grandfather was for, their religious system allowed for other religious systems to exist. It was okay. That's even how I've been teaching you guys about hoodoo. When we talk about hoodoo on these shores, hoodoo is a mix of our spiritual traditions in Christianity, our spiritual traditions in Islam, our African spiritual traditions and Judaism. The African religious mindset never demonized other belief systems. It was like, if that's what you believe, that's fine with me. So these religious systems that condemned our religious system, we allowed them in. And so when they were allowed in, because we didn't condemn them, they switched it up and condemned us. You see what I'm saying? That's kind of how they didn't condemn these other religions, but these other religions ended up condemning them. So that's another interesting thing that we find in chapter 1 of the autobiography of Charles Ball. We get some insight into a 10,000-year-old religion, and I'm going to go into that. I'm going to go into that into a little more detail. We also see that how he explained that what was that he said? I'm sorry, give me just a second. Yeah, I just want to tie up some things about it. Oh yeah, his father look, after the flight of my father, my grandfather was the only person left in Maryland with whom I could claim kindred. So what are we seeing there? What are we seeing there? We're seeing the Underground Railroad. Whether it was called the Underground Railroad or not, we're seeing the Underground Railroad. We're seeing our ancestors escaping to places that where a Negro can be free. The Underground Railroad wasn't something that began late in our history on these shores. I know the most famous figure of the Underground Railroad is Harriet Tubman. And we know that Harriet Tubman was alive when the Civil War took place. So when we think about Harriet Tubman, we're thinking about, 1840, 1850, 1860, 1870. We're thinking about mid to late 1800s. That's where we are right there. But this ancestor was actually born in the 1700s. He was born in like 1780, 1781, somewhere around there. And even towards the end of the 1700s, and even before, but we have evidence that even towards the end of the 1700s, we had in the beginnings of the 1800s, we had our ancestors knowing ways to escape to freedom. Now, whether they wanted to embark on these missions to escape to freedom or not, that was on them, because if they were caught, they were punished. So a lot of them didn't want to risk it. But we see that it actually happened. And so this when his father escaped, after his mother was sold, his brothers and sisters were sold, the only people he had left was his father and his grandfather. And then they had threatened to or they had not threatened, but his father was being sold to a plantation owner in Georgia, where his life was going to get extremely hard. Nobody wanted to go into the deep south. He ended up escaping. His father escaped. So right here in chapter 1, we're seeing evidence of the Underground Railroad as well. Okay, we're seeing evidence of the Underground Railroad as well. We're seeing individuals escape. Now, as we move forward, now the autobiography of Charles Ball is very, very long. I'm talking about like hundreds of pages. That's why I have to break it up into chapters. I have to break it up into pieces. It's no way I can read it all in one setting. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So this is, it's not going to be a long video. This was the autobiography of Charles Ball, chapter 1. And for those of you who just came in, I want you to go back and listen to the whole chapter, and understand that in this monument that these 4 U.S. Navy honor guards are saluting, that's our ancestor standing up on the right there. That's our ancestor on a monument, born in slavery. So as we get deeper into his story, it's going to get very, very interesting. We're going to talk about how he escaped, how he got free. We're going to be reading about exactly what he experienced on the plantations, what he's seen on the plantations. We're even going to see what he encountered. One man who had an iron collar around his neck, and attached to this iron collar, they had bells attached, because this guy had tried to escape several times. So they put this iron collar on his neck with bells on it to alert them whenever he was moving around. And the ancestor is going to tell us how he met him. And then, he went on about his life and he didn't see him. And then the next time he came across him again, this individual had committed suicide. And so we're going to see some of the horrific acts that our ancestors endured that made them commit suicide. We're going to see exactly how he escaped to freedom. And he participated in several wars, not just the one he's being honored for right here. He participated in several wars, even after being free. In the War of 1812, he was in the War of 1812, where we were fighting against the British. And the British were trying to tell some of our ancestors, hey, if you escape and defect to our side and help us fight against the Americans, we'll give you your freedom. Our ancestor chose not to try to defect to the side of the British. Instead, he fought as a free man. He decided to fight alongside of the American forces. And so his life is very interesting. We're going to get deeper into his life. And so the next time y'all see I'll touch on the autobiography of Charles Ball, we're going to be doing and reading chapter 2. So ancestor Charles Ball, may your name live on forever, and may your memory never die. This your brother Matthew Daniels, aka I'm Pooh, aka the Chosen Few, aka the real bookworm. I'm not just a bookworm, world. I am the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. And as always, may your name live on forever, and may your memory family, never die. Oh, before I go, I just seen a comment that came through earlier that I missed. Green Soap says great show to up slavery. The new Indians, pretendians are disgusting. Yeah, I just showed in this chapter that we read, his grandfather, Charles Ball's grandfather, came directly from Africa. We got the first hand account, and really I could do a show where I could show you over 100 instances of our ancestors telling you that their ancestors came directly from Africa, that they got tricked onto a boat, they got kidnapped, put on a boat. They tell you about the boat. They They tell you about everything. They tell you about everything. So Sandra Askew, that's what they slave owners said. King Gampu. No doubt, no doubt, no doubt, man. So hey, y'all have a good day. I'm finna tap out, and I'm gonna probably come back tomorrow, and we're gonna be reading chapter 2. Hotel.